Well, Keith, thank you so much for helping my project. Could you say a little bit about yourself?
My name is Keith Cowing. I'm the editor of NASAWatch.com, SpaceRep.com, and Astrobiology.com. I've been doing this for about 25 years. Before that, I had a real job. I used to work at NASA on the space station program and as a space biologist. And I was accused of being a journalist in the mid 1990s, and I sort of have not looked back since.
Well, I know I'm a big fan of NASA Watch. I always look forward to your tweets and articles and comments on articles and things like that. So um, it's a very important job.
Yeah, I usually tell people get a life. I mean, I, NASA Watch was meant to be a temporary thing in the 1990s, and it still lives in my basement, so I can't get rid of it. So,
That's um, that's awesome. But I mean, you have observed NASA back during the senior Bush days, the junior Bush days, and all the times between that. And you've seen um, basically our attempt to kind of figure out what to do with our space program. And this attempt to go to the moon in 2024, to me as an outsider, feels like the most real yet. And I was wondering how you felt about it, what your
well,
perspective.
my background actually goes even further. I started at NASA headquarters in 1987, so I was there when Reagan um, was putting forth what was going to become the Space Station Freedom, which is where I eventually worked. And there were a variety of initiatives back then. Sally Ride had a commission, and there was the Space Exploration Initiative. And then every 5 or 7 years, you'd see somebody say, hey, we should go back to the moon and go to Mars. And you'd see a flurry of activity. There'd be a report, and then NASA would say, well, it would be too expensive. And Congress says, yeah, okay. And so I've been through this 3 or 4 times. And of course, I did grow up during Apollo. So I had this foolish notion in my head as a child being told that we're going to land on the moon by the end of the decade when I would be 15. And we did it early, and that we'd be on Mars by 1981. And I thought, well, great, I'll be getting out of college and I can go work for NASA. And here we are. I just got my Medicare card, and we're still 15 years away from going to Mars. So it's a little frustrating, whether it's Mars or the moon or both, that these deadlines and these projects tend to pop up and go down a lot. But to your point about this being realistic, they've let contracts. They're building a rocket. They're cutting metal, and so there is a certain sense of reality to that. I'll give you that.
Yeah, I mean, the space industry may not be good about producing rockets, but we're sure good about art and PowerPoints.
Yeah, and unfortunately, back in the day, you could sort of tell how real something was by how much money they spent. Because I actually worked at Rockwell International in the early '80s on the shuttle program, and I actually in my office had, if you've ever seen any illustrations of the space shuttle or Apollo, I had all that artwork sitting in a big file behind my desk. It was actually part of my job, and the issue was, well, if you spend enough money to pay an artist to paint this, it must be real. And now, of course, with all the Photoshop tools and so forth, anybody can make a perfectly good spaceship. So, yeah, it gets a little deceiving right now. We seem to think that if you can PowerPoint it, you can fly in it, and it's not true.
And, well, I've done these interviews. My original goal was, Doug Laverio with his countdown to the end of 2024
Right.
and his daily hero of the day.
I like that.
In the December of, during the winter break, I was walking around. I was like, hey, we should do this with regular people. So my goal was to interview people at Starbucks and at the mall, at the airport, and what have you. And from December to the middle of March, I did that. And since then, I've had to move it online, interviewing connections and friends and family and friends of family and family of friends and family of family, that type of thing.
Yeah,
Um, but I would say, so most of the people that I've interviewed have not been into space. They've been, your
that's good.
average.
That's good to do that.
Yeah. And most of them had no clue that we were going back to the moon in 2024.
Well, it's interesting. Just yesterday, I was listening in on a teleconference, the International Space Station Research and Development Conference that's run by CASIS and the ISS National Lab. And they had a bunch of researchers on talking about their biology experiments and so forth. And I put a question, because we're all now in the Zoom, so I put a question in the queue. And my question was two-part. What do your coworkers, the other scientists, say when you tell them you're working on space? And two, what do your students say when you tell them you're doing that? And do they, influence their careers by, looking at this and being involved? And they all answered enthusiastically that their colleagues would say, there's research on the space station, tell me more. And when you talk to the students, they were completely jazzed by it, and that every one of them had at least one student who had altered their career path. And so us folks in the space community just seem to assume that everybody knows everything about the space station and all that, and no, it's not true at all. And I personally think, and if you were to ask me the question, I would say the worst thing space people can do is talk to other space people about the benefits of space. They should really do what you've done, just randomly go out to people in the street and put a microphone in their face and say, hey, what do you think about this? Because I think NASA if nothing else, NASA needs to hear what the real world thinks about what they're doing. And I think they'd be pleasantly surprised to find out that, well, perhaps they'd be upset to find out that not many people know exactly what's going on. But I think they'd be pleasantly surprised at their reaction when you or somebody like you would tell them what's going on, and might maybe tweak their PR and outreach a little bit to get to real people, not to focus on, the usual suspects, as I call them.
Absolutely. And, to that point, I've interviewed at least two people, one that said in 2011, they thought the entire program was shut down, with the retirement of the shuttle. They're like, I thought we weren't doing space anymore. What's going on? And another person even went as far as to say, why is NASA keeping it a secret about us going back to the moon?
Well, there you go. So yeah, it's like, there's no more NASA, or there is, but we're not, telling you about it. By the way, there's aliens and all that sort of, yeah, that's the frustration with NASA, is that, the people oftentimes believe NASA's budget is 10 times the size it actually is. And you get a lot of people now, to my consternation, who think we never walked on the moon, or that we've already been to Mars. And, all I can say is, perhaps NASA needs to just pay a little more attention to what people really think out there, and to maybe adjust things. And oftentimes they'll say, well, why do we want to address this thing about people not believing that we went to the moon? That's a stupid thing. Well, people believe a lot of things, and sometimes you need to dial down to the level that the people who pay taxes and pay for the party understand what's going on. And I think NASA, like I said 5 times already, I think NASA would find out very quickly that there's a willingness to know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, and just some little minor things like terminology have created absolutely the wrong idea in people's minds, like this idea of microgravity or 0G. You could go up to like 100 people, and I guarantee you 95 of them would tell you there is no gravity in space.
Well, and it's funny, you're right. And I used to, when I worked at NASA, I was actually in charge of the requirements for a big centrifuge that wasn't built. I was forever explaining, the difference between a centrifuge and centripetal force, and, orbits and things like that. I mean, if you just built a tower 120 miles tall up to where the space station is and just stood on it, you'd still have pretty much your weight. It's just the speed you're falling around the Earth, and we both know this. But I remember when I worked at NASA, I often got the pile of letters since I was young. I got the pile of letters to answer. And one of the more common ones was more or less, why don't you use the zero gravity chamber you have instead of going into space? And, how do you explain that? And then of course, they see the astronauts training underwater and think, well, they're weightless. No, they're just neutrally buoyant. That's the name of the facility. The only place that you can actually model microgravity close to Earth, and I've done this twice, is in parabolic flights, where you get about 22 seconds of apparent weightlessness by virtue of the parabolic trajectory that your plane is taking. But it's only 22 seconds long, and it's followed by, the same amount of time at 2 Gs, so you sort of pay for it. But that's, or you can have a drop tower where you build something that's, 100 meters tall and drop it, and then you get a few seconds of it. But that's the closest you can get to microgravity or zero gravity, whatever you want, on the surface of the Earth.
Now, my sons and I actually went on a 0G flight in February of 2018 here in Houston.
Oh, cool.
So,
cool. Okay, well, you know what it's like then.
I do. And, the funny thing is, like whenever I read a sci-fi book and they describe weightlessness, they start talking about how the guy feels like he's about to throw up and, like he feels like he's falling. That wasn't my experience at all. I had no sensation of falling or anything. And, I'd like to take some of these sci-fi authors and send them on such a flight too. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I did it twice, and I'm lucky. I am pretty much immune to motion sickness of any kind. I did not medicate. I tried, all the provocative moves they tell you not to do. I tried it. It didn't affect me. And the second time I went, I knew what to experience, and I just went and did a Superman to the end of the plane. I just didn't want to, I just. But the one thing, and I got to ask you, when you went to bed that night, did you dream about flying?
um, I don't remember dreaming about flying.
I've tried this because I did, and every time after that, when I would see somebody who's about to do it, I'd say, "You'll dream about flying," and every single one of them had that thought in their head. And the weirdest thing though is, remember when you get back and you sit down and you're sitting in the chair, and then somebody will say, or my friend said to me, "Can you imagine flying up to the ceiling?" And you can for that moment because you just did it. And they say, "Isn't that a weird thing to remember how to do?" But we've only did it for like 22 seconds at a time. Imagine what it's like if you just wake up in the morning and it's just, that's how your day is. I think we both enjoy experiencing that.
Yeah, it was fantastic. We did like the hamster wheel. So where you
Oh,
like use
did
your
you?
hands to like crawl around
Oh,
the
wow.
side.
You did what you went with your kids? That must be amazing.
It was. I wanted to bring my wife too, but she told me that somebody had to live, so I could.
Yeah, my wife and I went on a whaling boat one time, and I love the sea like that. She did not, so I think it's better that I do the zero jab. I've also done centrifuge training. I've done pulled 6.5 Gs, and my wife is like, "Well, that's interesting," but she just prefers rock climbing. So it's
But that's a whole another level of fear.
yeah, that's different. Yeah, you appreciate gravity. As a matter of fact, when I worked at NASA, we had a bunch of rock climbers, and we would schedule off an afternoon and say we're going for Gravity Appreciation Day. And the idea is we were going to prove 32 feet per second. But the interesting thing is that these are skills, actually, rock climbing, that when you talk to people who want to become an astronaut, they say, well, they tried to learn how to do everything, to scuba dive, to skydive, and you don't hear a lot of them saying rock climbing. But if you look at what the image you have in back, your Zoom background, I see a lot of hills and craters and stuff like that. There's going to be people who want to rappel down into those craters and climb up them. And so there's some other skills that I think a lot of people have that they don't realize will actually be valuable for space exploration. I mean, the guy behind you, I guess if you move a little bit, there's some guy with a bulldozer or digging or something like that. Well, I don't recall NASA ever recruiting bulldozer drivers. You're going to need that for the moon.
Oh yeah, indeed. I mean, people get physical with their environment.
Yes.
And that's one thing about the space station is it's a completely artificial environment. It's like you have every single atom of that space station is probably logged in 3 different places.
Yeah, and the other interesting, some very strange things about it. That is, since it's a long tube like this of all the modules, every now and then, you can actually see it flex a little bit like this, which to the uninitiated would probably be a little scary. It just reminds you when the shuttle used to take off. When the main engines would fire, it would go back like this, and then it would come. We call this the twang, and then it would come back and then fire the solids. So, but these are things that these are like living, breathing machines that, like you said, that they're just very complex, but they're also totally artificial. And this goes back to would everybody who's interested in space fly? If you just walk up to those people in the street, and say, "Would you fly in space?" I'm always amazed at the answers I get from space people, because there's a lot of space people who say, "There's no way I would do that."
Yeah, it's usually the question I end with. One day I was interviewing a mother and a daughter, and the mother was like, "Yeah, sure," and the daughter's like, "No," and the mother
Well,
was like surprised to see the daughter's answer. Like they
well
never
ask
talked
me the
about that.
well, ask me the question.
Would you go to space?
Yes,
Yes.
yes. See, I'm not gonna waste your time. Yes, of course I would.
Does that mean you're going to sign up for the space hero?
Yeah, I was almost going to post something about that today. You know, so many people. I'm old, so I mean, there's other people who probably are far more photogenic and can come up with the right things for the producers. I've worked. When I went to Everest base camp for a month with my friend astronaut Scott Parazynski, who went to the summit. But we were part of a team for Discovery Channel. I've been through the experience of what you see in these specials is not really what happened. It's all they're looking for moments and things like that. So these producers are going to be looking for people who have the right expressions. They're going to be looking for drama and stuff like that. And I just want to get in the rocket and go. And so I don't think I'd be perfect for that, but I would certainly encourage other people to do it.
Yeah, um, yeah, definitely. I mean, I know more about Ja. He's like their space evangelist person. He's a professor of he's an astrodynamicist at the University of Texas at Austin, and he spoke at our last month's North Houston Space Society. And then
Hmm.
Axiom Aerospace, they're a real company, unlike
Yes, yes.
unlike a lot of other, we'll train you to become an astronaut type companies.
Yeah, there's a few of those out there.
Yeah, I mean, Axiom, I think they really could send somebody to space, and they have a
Well,
contract.
Well, they do. I mean, Mike Suffredini runs the place. Mike LA is their chief astronaut. Mike's got more EVA time in the station than anybody else. So, and they've got some arrangements with NASA. So, yeah, they're a real deal. Some of these other companies, I've sort of highlighted a lot of them. I want to, say, all my support for trying to do this, but learning how to work and function in space, there's a lot to it, and a lot of it isn't apparent. And there is something that is kind of difficult to teach, and that is how do you explain to somebody that after you've learned how to do all the stuff to eat in space and poop in space and all that sort of stuff, you know that you're going to get on inside of something that could possibly blow up, and are you ready for that? And there's a couple people who signed up for Soyuz flights who have backed out when it became, the awesome risk that you're taking comes up to you. And of course, it's hard to explain to people that it's, sometimes more likely, like I said, when I was at Everest, I saw people, an avalanche where somebody was killed. I mean, it was right in front of me. And my friend had a certain factor of not coming back, but he'd been on 5 shuttle flights. So he was very good at working with the risk. The rock climbing that I brought up before, um, it's one thing to talk about climbing 1,000-foot cliff, but when I've done it, when you're hanging off of one, you learn something that you can only learn by doing. So for training somebody to fly like this, I'm just going to be curious to see what it is that the Space Hero people put in there to really find out, can these people really deal with life-threatening stress because they've actually had their lives threatened? I'm curious to see how they do it on TV, because there'd be a lot of lawyers who say, oh, you can't do that. You can't do that. But that's one of the things that you really have to sort of be willing to accept. Just like you have to be willing to accept the risk of getting in your car to drive, well, when we used to go to work, to drive to go to work or things like that. So that's the one thing I'm curious about, is how they deal with risk.
And I was thinking, since they're doing a global thing, there's a real opportunity to inspire and excite people from countries that don't have a human spaceflight program.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, this is a TV show, so I don't know what the producers, I don't know what their end product is going to be. I mean, it would certainly be nice to see somebody from Nepal or from Ecuador. I mean, that would be kind of cool. And as a matter of fact, if you've read NASA Watch, I really focus on the sort of soft power aspect of space exploration. And I remember one time my friend Pete Warden sent me a picture of somebody, a little kid on a computer in Chile, and he had a NASA logo T-shirt on. I'm thinking, why would this kid in this little town on the coast of Chile be wearing an NASA? And I figured out that what had happened, he was about 100 kilometers away from where the Chilean miners had been rescued by NASA.
Oh,
But then
wow.
when they have these, well, yeah, so who'd have thought? And yet to them, NASA's logo is like, this is an amazing group of people who came in and saved our people and then taught us about exploring the stars. And when I was in Nepal, I had a chance to teach a bunch of Sherpas how to just differentiate the lights in the sky. They thought they were all airplanes. I said, no, some of them are satellites. And when I explained how this was working to them, they went and were telling each other. And ever since then, it's a long story, but there's some projects that I helped in Nepal. There's now a little payload that's going to go on one of the landers to the moon. That's a piece of the summit of Everest from the Nepali side. And so, I think that the more countries and the more places that see space as something to aspire to, the more likely we are, the rest of us, going to get a chance to go there. So, the more fans, the better.
Yeah, and just putting that idea in their head as something that they could do. And I mean, if you also look at, I mean, New Zealand has a private capability to put stuff in orbit. It's like, where did that come from?
Well, it's interesting when I was my business partner Mark Boucher is a Canadian, and he went to China back just before Shenzhou, the first crude Shenzhou was launched. And he told me, he brought me back some models. It was Shenzhou everything. There was Shenzhou posters and candy and lollipops and diapers and the whole thing. And I've done some Chinese television ever since then. I've done Indian television and so forth. And they've asked me why it is that, these countries are so interested. And I say, well, it used to be a prestigious thing that the US or Russia would be sending people into space. We were like, there were two options, A and B. Then Europe got in on it. But I always ask, well, what is it that these countries are discovering that we've forgotten here in the West? And to them, it's a matter of national pride to be able to put somebody into space. And they use it much in the same way that I saw as a child during the Apollo era, where it was on my lunchbox and on my cereal, and everybody had the astronaut pajamas and all that whole thing. And so it is a great inspirational source. And unfortunately, here in the US, we like to think we're motivating people with space, and I think we are. But I think NASA has lost the innocence they had early on, where they would be as excited as everybody else and they would seek that out. Now they're sort of like, yeah, well, they'll sit there and they'll read you a list of things that you're supposed to think are important, and then that'll be it. So I think NASA could learn, if you were to ask me what NASA could learn from this, I think NASA could learn a lot from the reaction of the people of China and of Nepal and of India and of many other countries, Israel, sending their own missions into space.
Yeah, and one of the things that come up with the conversations I have with people is, how does space benefit us? And one thing that's goes into your coverage of cases and the space station, all that, has been creating a protein growth, actually growing crystals for doing some type of analysis, to figure out the placement of the atoms inside of that crystal. And I was reading a book for the person that got the Nobel Prize for figuring out the molecular structure of the ribosome. And in his book, The Gene Machine, he makes a passing reference to growing proteins or growing crystals on the International Space Station. Somebody told him, that's like a complete career ender or waste of time. And and despite, and it was almost like, I remember Reagan talking about this, and it seems like a constant theme that in a weightless environment, you'll be able to allow for these crystals to grow to the point that you can actually do the X-ray spectroscopy. I'm not sure.
X-ray crystallography.
Yes, that's it. Thank you. But I don't know of anything that's actually was.
There's a story to all of this, and it actually had its genesis back in the 1980s, when there were two big, and they were literally big, the size of refrigerators, experiments that were going to fly in the space shuttle. One was cell electrophoresis, where they were going to separate islet cells from pancreas, separate the cells that made insulin from the ones that didn't. It was difficult to do on Earth because you had to have an electrical charge that attracted some and not the others. But in the weightlessness or microgravity of space, that factor was nullified, and you could, with a smaller charge, separate those. And they thought, well, if we could isolate those cells, we can make this stuff in space and bring it back to Earth. Well, genetic engineering came in, and that experiment was pretty much, it was an interesting exercise, but it was pretty much moot by the time it flew. When I worked at NASA, the whole idea of X-ray crystallography, if you look at how the DNA structure before the ribosome, the DNA molecule was done by some amazing X-ray crystallography, where they get the double helix like this. And the idea behind more complex molecules is that if you get perfect crystals, they're sort of perfect iterations of the basic structure. The more perfect that crystal, the more perfect the imagery you can get from the various X-ray beams that are coming through. But on Earth, to get the crystals you want, as you form them, they sort of start to sag a bit, and you don't get perfection that you would need. So the idea was to make big crystals in space, capture them in a certain way, and bring them back. Well, NASA sort of dragged their feet on this, and they were doing some of it. Meanwhile, on Earth, they discovered a way to make teeny tiny, itty bitty crystals like at the nanotechnology level and use high power computing and lasers. So they can now kind of do what they thought they could not do on Earth. They can do it on Earth. And yet NASA's still working on this because there are some aspects of how intermolecular forces work that are very difficult to study on Earth because you have gravity pulling on things. So in my mind, the studies of protein crystallization in space went from how do we make a drug to how do we understand the processes that we could use back on Earth. It's all still valid. It just shows you what happens if you just sort of take too long to do something. Somebody will find a faster way and cheaper way to do it. It's a lot cheaper to do it on Earth than it is to do it in space. But if you do the right thing in space, you can make something on Earth cheaper to do. Yeah, the trick is to know which is which.
And the question comes up, how does space benefit us? And I feel like as space advocates, we need a better answer than, well, it benefits us in a lot of ways, and then it's like, well, name one. And you should have a couple on the tip of your tongue. And for me, I kind of struggle with the answer to that question, because it seems like it's really a whole bunch of either vague things, or when it comes to science, it's a whole bunch of very, kind of like narrowly focused things that you would spend weeks kind of explaining the significance of. I was kind of wondering how you answer that question.
Well, usually, there's a line here in Washington where you stand depends on where you sit. And here in Washington, they have talking points. They call them elevator speeches. Like, if you had somebody in an elevator and you had to explain in 30 seconds between 5 floors the importance of NASA, and they have stupid things like, did you know that satellites in space, it's like, yeah, no kidding. If I were just to like throw a dart at a map and go to somewhere in the middle of Des Moines, Iowa, at some town with 10,000 people, and somebody said, all right, explain this to me. I said, well, we're in an agricultural community. You obviously know there was tornado warnings and stuff like that, and weather, obviously, the satellites had to get into space somehow. So right off the bat, if anybody's lives have ever been saved by advanced weather forecasting, oh, by the way, the same satellites are providing, the information you need to predict your crops and things like that. But taking it further, if you live in a rural area, the only way sometimes you get your internet is through a dish in your roof. NASA would like to tell you all these other things. They've stopped sort of doing this. But they said, well, do you know those fire alarms on your ceiling? Well, NASA's technology. Well, that's true. NASA technology contributed to that 40 years ago. Let's think a little more relevant, and also just the notion that you can. Some people it works with and some it doesn't. You could say, well, just the basic understanding of the universe. We know more about our planet, and we're talking about climate change now, by studying it as a planet from space than we often could from Earth's surface. And part of the way that we learn, we go to Mars, we go to Venus, we go to Jupiter, we go to these other worlds. How we learn to observe those worlds, thus learn how to better observe our world and understand, if you're a proponent of this, that humans are causing the climate to be modified, that space may well determine, where it will be safe to live in the coastal areas in 10 or 15 years, just by studying patterns of how the oceans slosh around and stuff like that. But you could take it further, and again, just go back to crops, but also go to the whole notion now of distance learning. Before I was just talking about satellite internet. That's different than distance learning. Because distance learning is now we're all at home, and we use the satellite dishes, but you want it to be interactive. And so now you have these these companies like SpaceX and so forth launching these constellations that will allow two-way interaction. And of course, you can also toss in the fact that if you pick up your phone and you push a button and it says you're here, it may be using cell phone towers to triangulate where you are. But if you're in the middle of driving in the middle of without any cell phone towers, that's being done by a GPS unit, which is talking to satellites. And, it's hard to sometimes explain the obvious to people. I remember NASA Administrator Dan Golden once said, he was on TV and somebody was asking him, why do we need all these weather satellites when we have the Weather Channel? And, space is sometimes its own worst enemy because it is so ubiquitous and so useful that it's like asking, what's the value of air? And you go, whoa, I hadn't thought about that. Okay, that's part of the problem, is that space has become so weaved into our lives that we don't stop to ask, what's the value of roads and gasoline? Oh, hadn't thought about that. Well, maybe we should. And maybe NASA should start thinking a little bit more about, their talking points so that they actually resonate with real people, in the real world, and not just, their target audiences when they do these PR campaigns.
I have one justification I wanted to run by you and see if it holds water. I feel like so much of our scientific progress is from that flash of insight or that gut feeling. And whenever you have all of humanity experiencing a 24-hour day, 1 atmosphere of pressure, 1 g of gravity, um, that's going to give us one set of insights compared to when you start having people experiencing different lengths of day, different sets of gravity, different environments. Maybe it'll help to remove some of our intellectual blinders that might be keeping us from seeing the universe as it really is.
Well, I've had a little of that. When one of the things that I did is my company, my business partner Mark Boucher and I donated a greenhouse that was specially modified to withstand Arctic winters, and we built it up on Devon Island, which is 800 miles from the North Pole. And we designed it. It's a greenhouse on Earth, but it was designed to function like an automated greenhouse on Mars, and all this sort of satellite links and automated devices and so forth. But when you go to Devon Island, you're 800 miles from the North Pole. That means it's 24-hour daylight. I adapted instantly. I can sleep anywhere. Some people had problems dealing with that. So right off the bat, that was otherworldly. So my internal clock was off. Second, it looks like Mars, which is sort of one of the, it's just devoid. It's next to a giant impact crater. And so you think you're on another planet because it's everywhere and you can't escape it. Thirdly, you're isolated. And again, this goes back to the risk thing. When we were designing this greenhouse, we test assembled it inside a hangar at NASA Ames Research Center. And if I had cut my finger or fallen, I would have just picked up my phone and called, and I would have been in a hospital. But we realized quickly that we planned ahead for this, because you don't want to do your homework at the research station. You want to do it before you go. And so when we got there, I realized, if I'm not going to maybe hang off this beam with a drill, because if I fell, I could get hurt. And so I only realized that because I was in an isolated environment where I could just about do something that would, and again, that's a lesson that has to be taught. And so you combine all this together with the fact that the airplane that landed us there was sort of like, it's a Twin Otter. It sort of lands like this. It's not really a helicopter, it's an airplane. And you're isolated and you're totally dependent on 2 satellite dishes up on a hill for your communication elsewhere. And it's all those things taken together in this special environment. It was very similar when I was at Everest Base Camp. We were isolated and we were at 17,000 feet and so forth. That I got a clear impression of what it might be like. And of course, we had astronauts walking around too. What it would be like to possibly be on another world. But that only happened because of a confluence of things where we had the money. We were in on this project with several space agencies and so forth. Not everybody is as lucky as I am to have experienced that. And I'm not sure right off the bat how you could really relate that to everyday people, and to have them sort of appreciate, like you said, what's it like to live in a world where the day is 24 hours long. Well, I've been through that. 24-hour sunlight. Other than people could possibly get interested in how to build analogs of these bases on their own, using things in their own environments, and to try and replicate some of this stuff, and then bring other people in. The Challenger Centers, for example, for kids. I used to be on the board. They try and run the kids through a mission operation to give them an idea of what it might be like to control a mission. But I guess the only way that you could really get to the issue you talked about breaking outside this 24-hour a day, 8 hours of daylight and then sunlight thing and darkness, is to purposefully find a way to expose people to different ways of thinking, and add in a communications delay. Because if you're on Mars and you're trying to talk to somebody, you just can't pick up your phone and talk to them. But we have an experience like that. If you text somebody, they may not be looking at their phone right away. They may not look at their phone for half an hour. Well, we function just fine texting people. That may be the answer to talking to, that is an analog to living in space, having asynchronous communication. And a lot of people don't realize that every time they text somebody and you're waiting for an answer, you're simulating what it would be like to live on 2 different worlds.
I wanted to be respectful of your time. I know we're right at the top of the hour. Did you have some more time or did you have to go?
I've got plenty of time.
Oh, okay. So what happened to your greenhouse?
Well, it's still there. It ran for 3 seasons. It's sitting there waiting for somebody to do some repair work on it. But the way we set this up was um, this notion of something called a planetary analog, where it's an analog of certain aspects of that environment. It's not a perfect copy, because if you had a perfect copy of that alien environment, you'd be there, right? But you pick the parts of it that you want to work with. One of them was the fact that whatever we did, this thing is up there by itself on a polar desert island, 800 miles from the North Pole, with our polar bears walking around. We had to punch holes in our greenhouse more than once. And you got to think, this forces you to think, how do I make this system robust enough that it'll work? And if it fails, it'll still work. And if it fails, it'll still work. And did I think everything through in terms of, like, for example, the greenhouse I bought, I had to modify it. Instead of having the pillars 6 feet apart, I had them 4 feet apart to make it stronger. And I anchored it into the ground, into the permafrost, and we did a bunch of other stuff. But once we got it going, we had several seasons where the greenhouse woke up. It started irrigating some seeds that had been planted the season before. And we got lettuce, and I forget what else. We had several types of lettuce and another small cultivar, I forget what it is. But we had an automated weather station, a computer system, a weather monitoring system, an internal monitoring system, and they all worked fine. So we got some papers out of it. And one of the interesting applications of it is that now in Nunavut, up in the northern parts of Canada, being able to grow your own food throughout the year is an important thing. So some of the lessons we learned about how to run a greenhouse on Mars are being applied in Nunavut, northern Canada. So,
That's
but
amazing.
on top of that, it was also just a fun thing to do because it looked like it's silver and so forth, and it looked like a little alien. It's like the movie Silent Running. Which was my inspiration for this. It looked like somebody had dropped this glittering little greenhouse on this alien planet and just left it.
Yeah, are there volunteer opportunities to assist with that?
Well, right now, no, because that project ended, and right now, because of COVID-19 and so forth, I don't think anybody's actually gone up to the Devon Island research site, and I don't know when that will be changed. As a matter of fact, I think it's difficult to travel to Nunavut. But like anything, these projects need money, and we funded a lot of that ourselves. And that after a while, it's like, okay, well, that was our tax write-off and so forth. But there are other places, there's other organizations and so forth that do things that do have projects. And I mean, there's one thing, if you want to just collaborate with people, there's something called the International Space Apps Challenge, or the NASA Space Apps Challenge. And that's October 2 to 4. And all you have to do is look on Twitter. There's 1,000 different groups doing this. And they get into a whole bunch of different aspects of citizen science and volunteerism and so forth. So I would encourage people to look into that.
That sounds good. So in terms of like us going back to the moon, there's a Senate hearing today about the budget.
It started 7 minutes ago.
7 minutes ago. How, I guess, what would you be looking for to see if this is something that's really going to happen or not? Like, I mean, when would you? I mean, do you still have hope that the 2024 will happen, or do you think it's already too late? I mean, like, what's your thinking?
Well, I'm an optimist. I like to. I'm just an optimist by nature, but I'm a realist in terms of when I, look at things, and I'm some real pessimist, like all journalists tend to be. So somewhere between the optimism and the pessimism is where I am. NASA needs a certain amount of money to start work on the human lander. They needed 3.2 billion. The House only gave them 600 million, so they're short by whatever it is, 2.6 billion. And so the Senate needs to pony up that money. And here we are in the middle of a pandemic with a global economic crisis and so forth. And the question is, will that money be there? Administrator Bridenstine is probably, as we speak, saying that he's hopeful that when the Senate and Congress, House come together for the final budget. Right now, they just passed a continuing resolution, which will carry the government for a couple of months. But at some point, they have to do what's called an omnibus bill, which collects all the different appropriations together. And he's hoping that in that bill will be the remainder or the full allotment of 3.2 billion for the lander. If it is not, or if that omnibus doesn't happen at the end of the year, it may happen in the spring. But if that money isn't in there, he said, well, we'll land on the moon as soon as we can. The problem is a pacing issue, and the pacing issue is you've got this marching army of people doing things, and you have to pour money into this to keep it going. And if you don't have a certain level of money, you run the risk of laying people off, which means you have to go get them again, or you have to pay them to sort of slow down and work. And the more you don't give enough money to these projects, the more it costs in the end. And everything's already over budget and behind schedule to begin with. So it's not a good situation. Add in the fact that the Congress, at least the House, has expressed an interest in moving back to the original 2028 landing date as opposed to 2024. Some have said 2026, but and they sort of see the 2024 date as wholly political, and that it was picked so that it would be at the end of a second Trump term. Some people think that was just too soon. Others say, like Jim Bridenstine will say, well, it's good to have a date close in so that you're really motivated to go do things. He's not incorrect. The problem is that if you don't have the financial resources to make that happen, you're not going to reach that date. So where do I think this is going to be? Well, it depends on the election. If the current administration stays in, they've shown a willingness to put their money where their mouth is. So maybe they'll put the money in. I don't know. If the Biden folks get in, my guess is that you'll see that they'll want to slip that back because we're in the midst of this giant, pandemic economic thing. And, the issue is, where does the money need to get spent to, fix everything in the country? Is space one of those things? Probably not, but space is a government program and it employs people. And the Biden administration may say, well, maybe not 2024, maybe it's 2026, but we don't want to fire a bunch of these people. We want them to have jobs. So it's kind of hard to say. And really, quite frankly, we'll know whenever it's known where the election results are, I can give you a much firmer answer. But until then, you have to act as if it's going to happen. And that's what NASA's trying to do.
And I guess there's really no hope of Bridenstine staying on if there is a change of.
I wouldn't say that. I mean, Jim's done a really good job. I'm anybody who's read my website, will know that I was enthusiastic about his choice. Usually when a party switch happens between Democrats and Republicans, whichever way, they want to bring their own people in. But there has been an instance, Dan Golden managed to survive across 3 different administrations. So it's been done before. I wouldn't predict that Jim would be asked to leave or encouraged to stay. I think that just depends on what the game field looks like at the time. I know there's other people that are under consideration to run NASA if Biden wins, but again, they may, Biden seems to be wanting to, not mess up things that are not messed up yet. And maybe that's one way of keeping NASA on track, is to keep the leadership in place. I don't know.
I mean, I've been really impressed by Jim Bridenstine. He actually, he graduated from Rice University here in town, and he came to talk one time, so I actually got to see him. I thought that's kind of cool. But, his confirmation was like 51-49, completely along partisan lines.
Well, that's how it is here in Washington. Everything's like that. But I mean, I have to say, and people know this, I'm very fond of how Jim has done things, and he gets better at it every day. And I just maybe wish he had gotten the job under different political circumstances. I do, and he's young. I mean, he's got decades ahead of him wherever he goes. But we are in the midst of the politics that we are confronted with, and I think, given what's happened to other government agencies here, and I'm a Democrat, I'm not going to mince words here. I think he's done an amazing job of not letting NASA get dragged into political arguments about things. And as I just said on NASA Watch the other day, NASA still pursues the scientific research about climate change, And I have not seen any evidence that the White House has slapped them down or told them to stop doing that. So, for whatever role Jim had in isolating NASA from the politics, it's a good one, and he's done a good job at it. And I hope he continues to do it.
If the confirmation was reheld today, do you think it would be more in his favor, or still be the kind of like the same result?
I think it would end up being the same result. I mean, everything's partisan now, and you have to really give a Democrat or a Republican a good reason to cross over to the other side. And we see so few rare opportunities of that happening that, quite frankly, the Republicans will put in who they want to because they can. And it's up to the Democrats whether they want to try and support it or not, because they don't really have the votes to stop it. And that this is not just NASA, it's everything. I don't know that that'll change if the election moves from one White House to another. I honestly don't know. It is very frustrating for everybody at NASA, though, because, this is something where I think everybody, Democrat or Republican, would really like to see humans walking on the moon again. And politics, unfortunately, is holding the strings up right now on pretty much how that happens or how it doesn't happen.
Well, and do we not need a different structure from like an organizational, governmental perspective to actually do these long-ranging projects so that we're not constantly changing?
Yeah, there's funny. Some people said, well, maybe you should have the NASA administrator appointed like the NSA. That's kind of goofy. I mean, no matter who appoints the administrator at any given time, something will change and so forth. So that's, I don't think there's anything, that should be changed there. In terms of, long-term programs, we have programs that are, and this came up with President George W. Bush, the Vision for Space Exploration. One of the talking points was, well, whatever we do in terms of going back to the moon, this is back in 2004, it's got to be able to withstand a dozen Congresses and several White House administrations and so forth. So you got to have a plan that really everybody signs on to, and then you got to have a Congress that's willing to vote the budget year after year. And you don't really see Congress voting multi-year appropriations for things. And so you, in essence, have to plan your program either from a basis of hoping you'll get your money, or planning that you won't get all of it, or having contingencies. And oftentimes you'll find out that NASA actually has 3 different plans at any given time. The one that they have to work with, the one that they want, and the one they expect. And they're not necessarily the same thing. And so imagine you're going out with your family and the end goal is to eat dinner somewhere. And one is, well, if there's construction, I can't go to Arby's, but I can go to, wherever. And you're sort of like, okay, what's my decision point here? It becomes a simple task. Go back to the moon. It becomes very complicated. And this is what you see now. I don't see that changing anytime soon, especially again now with the political situation that we're in. But, back when, Europe was doing its exploration in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, they thought multi-year because they had to, because these trips took many years to do. Going to the Arctic, going to the Pacific, and they had to think multi-year, and they thought grand strategy and things like that. We don't do that anymore. And I mean, the last time we did was Apollo, and Apollo just barely happened. I mean, the money was there for it to happen, but after the first landing, if you've seen the movie Apollo 13, I lived through this. I remember being frustrated that they didn't have all the EVAs on all the time. And why are they doing this? Well, because it wasn't newsworthy anymore. And so, that's a fact of life. And the only way to maybe surmount that is to just make, some people have said, only NASA could make space exploration boring. I think somebody needs to possibly get in a position at NASA to really try and make NASA something that kids wake up in the morning and think about. I mean, Elon Musk has talked about this, from his perspective of, how do you give people a positive future to look forward to, that and to let them know that they can play it affects them personally, and that they can have a role in it if they want to have it. And it's not just paying taxes, it's actually having a career that either creates the space technology or directly uses it. I think if you can move all those things together and make it, and put it on an iPhone app, you've got it.
Yeah, and talking about the exploration and the multi-year thing, I was just thinking the governmental structure then was quite a bit different too, with kings and queens and lifetime appointments.
Well, yeah, I mean it was, and that's you're quite correct. And but it usually went down to the kings or queens or whatever, thinking of national prestige, and there was always sort of a, an economic side to this as well. I think one thing that may factor in differently than people think is when Blue Origin and SpaceX and some of these companies really start to actually see a positive cash flow coming in from a variety of things in space, then then you're going to see them going off and doing stuff. As I said to people, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and so forth read far too much science fiction when they were kids, and it stuck. And they don't know any better than to try and make it real. And they have the resources to do it, and they're doing it, and you can't stop them. And I think that may be an impetus where it's not just the government anymore. And hopefully, if NASA's paying attention, they'll feel a little nervous and say, yikes, these guys are going ahead of us. Maybe we should be playing catch up. Or better yet, maybe we should just get out of their way. Or even preferable, we should partner with them. And then you have a whole variety of ways that you can utilize space. Some of them traditional and some of them non-traditional. But the old model, like I said, with Apollo, that was then, this is now. And to expect anything like that to happen again is naive, but it's also, pessimistic to say that there is not a different way to get the same level of excitement. Like I've said, you just got to go understand the audience and the factors and then tool your PR appropriately. And NASA doesn't really do that very well. They transmit, they don't listen.
And some would say that they're not even transmitting. So there's that too.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look out at humanity 500 years from now, do you really see humans throughout the solar system? And we're completely we have bases on the moon and bases on Mars, and we're doing asteroid mining, and we have these huge arrays of solar panels, and we no longer think of space as being like a different place, but people actually just grow up there. Or do you think we're still pretty much on the Earth, just making these little short trips to places?
I'm an optimist. I mean, I grew up. I think that enough people will find a way to make that happen, that it will happen. It'll probably happen differently than we think, and the stuff may look different than we think it might. There are certain aspects of technology right now that are coming into play, like AI, nanotechnology, 3D printing, and stuff like that, where it may be easier to make things in space to use in space than on Earth. Which before you'd write about it in a book, you'd say, well, then we'll have a factory that makes a thing in space, but nobody knew how that factory would work. Well, now we have 3D printing, and now we're 3D printing things in the space station, and we're recycling them. So it may be that the best lunar spaceship to land will be one that lands, lets you out, takes off your cargo, and either takes off, or you rip it apart and melt it and make it into something else on the moon. I think my earphone's going to die in a second here, so I may have to swap to a microphone on my computer.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting about 3D printer. I have a couple of 3D printers back here, and they're really slow, just putting like a little dot of plastic in each of the spots. But, in like a weightless environment, just being able to use like electrostatic forces to reposition materials seems like a really amazing concept.
Okay, I'm going to turn off my AirPod microphone. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, hang on a second here. Unfortunately, I didn't charge my batteries up here, so can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, let me.
Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, I can. Okay, so anyways, yeah, the 3D printing in space, that was something that I remember my friend Bill Reedy, who used to be the head of human spaceflight, was talking about, what will be the 2x4 in space? And back then, you didn't call it whole 3D printing, you called it hololithography, printing. And but the idea was what is the thing that we can take up there that we bring up for one reason and then we use it for another? And again, I go back to my Devon Island experience. When I was taking the greenhouse up there, we had to ship a whole bunch of stuff up in a National Guard C-130, and they took it out and they left it outside for a while. And I guess somebody at the airport thought that that was free plywood and whatnot, and so they took some plywood. And there's these fairing strips that went in to hold the plastic of the greenhouse together with the aluminum, and couldn't find them. And so I had to make fairing strips out of a sleeping pad mat temporarily. And because
Are you still there? Looks like you might be frozen.
Me.
Oh, there you are. Okay,
Oh,
cool.
yeah, okay. Yeah, my internet connection is unstable apparently. Well, I don't know if you heard all of that, but the long story short is, you know, you need to be designing your resources you take with you because it's expensive to launch stuff. Don't just throw it away. Once you get there, use it. And it may be that the mylar that you have on the outside of the spacecraft to keep it the temperature control, you can take that off and reuse it elsewhere. And that the landing legs are made out of a sintered metal that you can feed into a solar oven on the moon and then reprint it as something else. I think that's the sort of mindset that, you know, again, the books that I read in the 70s and 80s sort of talked about that, but they didn't know how to do it. Well, we now do it. So I think that's why I think you may see that space colonies and things like that may have a somewhat different look. I mean, you may see that the bases on the moon and Mars may use 3D printed like mud or cement made out of local resources. And they may look kind of goofy compared to the fancy domes and things that we usually see, but they may be far easier to make, especially if you can use solar energy to like melt the grains of regolith together to make a glass or something like that. Or bases, you may not even see them. They may be inside of lava tubes. So yeah, I think this is all going to happen. I just think, you know, there was this movie once called Being There. Being there teaches you a lot more than thinking about being there. And I think that, you know, like I said, I don't know if it's going to be like, you know, the Babylon 5 future or the, just pick your sci-fi genre. I think it'll be all of those, but things that we haven't thought of yet.
Yeah, and you know, as you were talking about the ability to sort of like use things differently than what they were intended for, you know, I keep thinking that some of the commonplace technologies that we hope to get out of this is sort of shrinking the cycle of materials running through our society. So, you know, you take your plastic materials, you put them in some device, and then out comes new things that you need.
Yeah, yes.
You know, and so you just buy the designs and you just, you know, you don't have plastic that goes into a recycling bin that goes to, well, hopefully someplace to be recycled or a landfill.
Yeah, and the Made in Space guys actually learned this. It was kind of interesting. They went up there with their hardware when they were printing stuff, and then they learned from having printed stuff, and the new designs that they used to print further iterations of their designs, they emailed them up as a data file. I mean, that's like, okay, that's how we do things. And the funny thing is that so many of the advanced technologies that NASA's probably going to make use of, your kids are probably doing in your basement. Maybe you don't even know about it. But I mean, you know, the fact that they have, this would have been a supercomputer when I worked at NASA in the 90s. And now it's like, you know, it's old and so forth. And I don't think NASA has really brought together a lot of this commonplace, what's called COTS, commercial off-the-shelf stuff, quite yet. But this is why I hope that things like the Space Apps Challenge and so forth, and continued experimentation on the space station will give NASA a chance to really sort of deploy this stuff. So, you know, it may well be that, you know, well, as a matter of fact, I gotta give you another example. If you look at the space station right now, you see little gene chips, which are, and this is actually like this big, where you plug it into a laptop, you then put a DNA sample in it, and it will sequence it in a matter of hours.
Wow.
Now, I'm a biologist, I'm a space biologist. And when I worked on the space station back in the 1990s, we were barely out of the continuous flow electrophoresis era, which was a refrigerator-sized thing that I talked about earlier. And so the notion that you could just take one of these things, spit in it, plug it into a computer, and it could tell you, you know, what color your grandmother's hair was. That would have just been, yeah, sure, Keith, and beam me up too, but while you're at it. But now, and our payloads were these giant racks, and I was actually in charge of the requirements for these racks. And now we still have those racks, but we plug little things into them, and the little things we plugged into them are technology that didn't even exist at that point. It's kind of like having a, you know, I've got a desk lamp here that's from the 1920s, and it's got a little LED bulb in it, because the interface is the same for the bulb, but that bulb would have not have been possible. And so what you're seeing is this sort of non-synchronous or asynchronous technology where you have a space station design with shuttle thinking and Russian hardware that goes back to their lunar program era. And you've got computer systems in there that range from old laptops that run Windows to iPads. and then you've got advanced nanopore technology to sequence. And it all works because they have standard interfaces. And yet you would not have been able, and CubeSats are being popped out like candy out of a Pez dispenser. None of this would have been thought of if somebody hadn't said, what if? And that's why I keep saying, when you ask me, well, what it'll look different. I just know, I don't know what it'll look like, but it'll look different.
Yeah, as you were describing the space station and sort of like the legacy of the various layers of the hardware, I was like thinking, that's sort of like a lab at one of these old colleges, like at Harvard. The building itself was built out of stone by people 200 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then,
as a matter of fact, I remember I went to Green Bank, the observatory in West Virginia, where they do SETI research, and I was there with Jill Tarter. And I was inside the giant, I wasn't inside the biggest dish, but it was the large one they were using. And it was this giant, battleship plugged into the ground, this huge thing of stone and so forth, with this giant, because it had to be able to hold the dish against wind. And it had these giant gears. I mean, they were the size like this. And they had giant cables that looked like things I had seen in old factories. And this thing was built in the 50s. And then there was a computer that controlled that was literally, I think, an XT. So it ran some old software there. And this is in 1997, so this is 20 something years ago. But then I started looking around. I actually wrote about this. Then you have a new Mac Classic, and then you had a Mac X and an IBM machine and so forth. And then you had this blue rack of the SETI search hardware, which was last week's technology. And it was sort of like this, I could go like this with my head, like a panorama with my camera, and look across 50 years of technology. It all still worked. Yeah, we should probably replace that little computer that runs the gears, but it works perfectly, so why should we? But on the other hand, the search algorithms that they wanted to do would never have been possible. And that's where you focused on the technology. So like I said, it's sort of like having a steam-powered computer. And you had this asynchronous collection of technology. And again, think about this. You go to the moon, and you may find out that it's just like the space station. We're literally in a space station that's a 25 to 30-year-old design in many ways. And yet it's cutting edge.
Well, about the whole kind of in-space manufacturing and 3D printing and using materials, I think ultimately we'll get to a point where we have like autonomous devices like on the moon, on asteroids and other moons and what have you, getting like the material, feeding it into like a manufacturing device. So now you want a probe on Venus, you just send the plans and now you have a probe on Venus, or what have you.
Well, what you may find is that, like, for example, you could land something on the surface of Venus that expects to see 800-degree temperatures outside, expects to see metals in a certain molten state that are readily available. And NASA is already talking about, I just read something about this last week, coming up with robotic gears that will actually function at those temperatures. And it may well be that the probe that lands is somewhat of a von Neumann machine that sort of makes copies of parts of itself. And then maybe what it does is it immediately sort of makes a shield around itself or of local materials to extend its life. Or that maybe it sends out little, materials that have a thermal conductor sort of difference that generates electricity, but that is manufactured using local materials. Certainly on Mars, you've seen the whole in situ resource utilization idea where you land, your spacecraft, you bring hydrogen and you make the methane and that whole thing. But that also, one in this case, uses Martian water, ice, to create rocket fuel, but also, life support materials, but also pulls in the atmosphere, even though it's very thin, it is carbon dioxide. And then you're just getting into, I'm looking at my old organic chemistry books. Then you just got to have machines that can do simple organic chemistry, and you can make pretty much anything you want. You may have to bring nitrogen with you, but the idea again is, think of where you're going and what you want to do there, and how little you need to take with you, but how capable what you take with you is. And like I said, it may be that half of what you send there is a robot that makes more of itself.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a really exciting future. Well, I really appreciate your time. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
I think we've covered just about everything. I think it's interesting that, I normally, when I do interviews, I do, TV, millions of people hear that sort of stuff. I've done it hundreds of times. And it's interesting now that I've worked at home for 25 years. So I'm used to, I've done my job from Devon Island. I've done it from Everest Base Camp. And so I've always been completely virtual. But it's interesting more recently that everybody's adopted this, Zoom approach to things, whereas people weren't just thinking that way. And the thing that I'm trying to impress on these NASA people is, they would have these telecons at work, and then they'd go home at 3:30 and then they wouldn't have to do anything. But now where you are is where you work, and that it's an asynchronous mode of communication, and you're doing it all virtual like this. Everybody's just become more of an astronaut than they've ever been before. This is what it's going to be like when your colleagues work on another world. You're going to be looking at a screen, looking at a camera, knowing where the light is, arranging the light so it's better or worse, and having a good microphone, but also thinking in advance, what do I need to do to maximize this time? But also, there may be a time delay where I say something and I wait for you to nod. That's something that I think a lot of NASA people probably never thought they'd have to become an experiment, part of an experiment in, but now virtually the entire agency is in virtual astronaut asynchronous communications mode. And I hope that teaches them something about how all these systems need to be designed when this whole notion of having a lot of humanity off-world comes into play.
Yeah, it's kind of funny as you were mentioning that. I was thinking about these little scholastic books I read as a child where it's like design your own story. It's like you read a little bit and it's like, does he go into the door or not? If he goes in the door, turn to page 27. If he doesn't, turn to page 12, and then you read a little bit more. Conversations from Mars are going to be like that. If you say yes to this, then it does.
Well, it was funny because it was when I was in Nepal and I had an Iridium satellite phone with me, and there's a lot of big mountains in Nepal. And I would call my wife, and we had a sort of a plan that the signal would last for a short period of time. And if I lost her 3 times, the third loss meant goodbye, I love you. I wasn't going to call her back to say goodbye, And I was standing outside, and I could sort of figure out where the Iridium was. I could see them come over the horizon, and I would dial like this. And I would talk to my wife. Well, my Sherpa Tashi was there with me. And this is where I had this discussion with him. And he says, he knew what a satellite phone was because he'd been to Summit of Everest 10 times, and he would work with teams. But I was explaining to him that I had to look to see the satellite, and that's where we got into the whole issue of, well, I thought that was an airplane. No, there's satellites. And I explained it to him, and he's a very smart guy. But he says, well, if how come they're light? It's nighttime. I said, well, imagine a mountain that was 100 kilometers tall. What would the top look like? And he says, oh, it would still be bright because the sun would reach it and go, okay, that's what we're seeing. And a light went off in his head in terms of what that was and what it meant and how it was explained to him. And then I went further, said, well, this is a north-south satellite. It's probably an Earth Resources one, the one going like this and then like this. That's probably an Iridium. The space station will fly over in a little while. And of course, I had explained to him that I was going to meet a space station astronaut up at Everest. And so, explaining this to him, he now said, yeah, I understand now, because he says, the people who come over here get very frustrated that they can't call their wife. And I was explaining, or they don't have long enough to talk to their wife. And yet my wife and I had sort of, I'd been to Devon Island 3 times by this point. So we sort of had the short conversation thing down. But it's something you have to learn by doing. It's not like, you pull a checklist out and say, all right, hi, honey, how are you? Fine, how are you? No, you don't do that. You just sort of have, and you have to learn to prioritize what's important versus what's trivial. And sometimes you get a bonus phone call or two. And I mean, this happens when my friends call me from Antarctica all the time. You have these conversations and you quickly get through the, how cold is it? What's the news? And then if you haven't lost your connection, you say, oh, hey, so what's up? It's a different way of talking. And again, a lot of NASA people are, learning this hands-on. And they're also learning that you don't need perfect HD TV, perfect audio for everything, that, you can have what I call the max headroom effect, And again, this goes to Everest. I mean, I would have this, Miles O'Brien was our guy back east, and Scott and I would be doing live stuff on YouTube. And of course, it was really crappy picture, like Max Headroom, if you're familiar with Max Headroom. And people would say, well, it's a really crappy picture, but it's live from Everest, okay? That's the point. And you're communicating and the message is getting through. So I hope NASA sort of realized that, your background isn't perfect. I can see your head with I don't pay attention to that anymore. And I think a lot of folks at NASA are probably learning how to, deal with crappy comms, as they would say, better than they normally would have been able to do. And again, maybe that'll filter into how they communicate with spacecraft, but also to the general public. And they may see, up until now, you wouldn't have gotten a NASA person doing what you and I are doing right now because the background isn't perfect, the lighting isn't perfect. And they would say, well, I can't just talk to this guy on this webcast because I got to go into a studio. Well, now, so I'm hoping maybe this will also help NASA with its willingness to do outreach that goes beyond the normal, studio settings. So
Yeah.
that's all I can think of saying right now. I think I've exhausted the topic.
I did want to ask about, you said you're sending a rock from Everest to the moon. Is that through Astrobotic and their DHL moon box?
It is actually, it is, and there's a funny story. It's Michael Kronmiller is actually doing this because Michael worked with some projects in Nepal that came from some work that I had done. And so was actually inspired by what Scott Parazynski and I did. When we went to Everest, I actually brought a little, find something about this size, a little piece of lucite, was about this big, which had 4 little Apollo 11 moon rocks in it. And I kept it in my pocket the whole time because that was the safest place to put it. And then we created a container and Scott took it to the summit of Everest and he held it up to take a picture of it. And then he brought that back. And then later we sent those 4 little Apollo 11 moon rocks, plus a piece of the summit of Everest up to the space station. So they're in the cupola now. And if you look, if you know where to look, you can see this little plaque. And Michael was inspired by this. And as he would tell people about this in Nepal, and they had heard about this. And so they were so inspired, they said, well, can we send a piece of Nepal to the moon? And Michael said, well, sure. And of course, with the Astrobotic, you can buy these little, I think they're about this big, payload containers. So Michael ponied up the money and he's going to send a piece of Everest to the moon. So again, unintended consequences. Scott and I just thought this would be cool to do, to take, moon rocks to the summit of Everest and, and so forth. But now it's inspired other people, again, from this, I think Nepal is ranked over 200, way down the bottom of the economic development list. And yet there are people in Nepal who dream of going into space. That's the important end result you want from all of this.
But I just want to let you know, I've also bought a moon box and I'm planning to put all these interviews on a micro SD card.
Oh, cool. I'm going to the moon.
You're going to the moon.
All right. I knew I'd get there some way.
Excellent.
That's cool. That's cool. That's the thing, is buying these moon boxes is actually, I forget, how much do they cost?
$460 for the smallest.
Yeah, tempted.
Yeah, that's gives you it's about the same size as a micro SD card. So
yeah, that's what Michael told me. So if I can find something here, I can show you something that I sent to. If I just look on my desk here, I have to find it. Yeah. I was sort of particular about what I sent to the summit of Everest, and there were many things that I could have sent. And I thought, well, maybe the most appropriate thing to do would be to send my old expired, voided NASA badge. So this has been to the summit of Mount Everest. It's been to the South Pole. It's been to Devon Island. And now I got to figure a way. I've got some little summit rocks here too. I got to figure a way to get this into space. So I don't want to ruin it. Maybe I could break it into pieces and put it into one of those cubes. But maybe I'll think about doing that.
Yeah, a little corner of it or something.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Keith.
Oh, my pleasure.
I look forward to staying in touch, and I definitely look forward to all your posts on NASA Watch. Okay, well, stay tuned because it's going to get, no matter what happens, it's going to be different and interesting here. It's going to be maybe a difficult time for NASA, but I have a good feeling that they'll come out of it okay. Well, you have a good rest of your day, and thank you, sir. Talk again later. Ad Astra. Ad Astra.